It's good to see you all again. I'm glad to be up here once again to do this Bible study with you all. Last week, we covered a lot of material as far as the historical context of the intertestamental period, if you would call it that, I listed on that outline. And today, we're going to cover the Roman occupation portion of that historical. So it'll be like kind of the end of the intertestamental period, and throughout the majority, if not all, of the New Testament would be underneath the Roman rule. So as I broke it down last week, there are three different periods in the Bible you could look at to kind of divide it up time period-wise. And that would be the Old Testament period. And within that period, you have the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire. And we talked about last week a little bit of the impact of each of those empires. A lot of it can be viewed in the Old Testament, specifically the Babylonian and the Assyrian, as well as the Persian in the latter half of the Old Testament. But there was a lot of influences from the Persian Empire that we see that really influenced the culture of the Jews in the New Testament. If anyone remembers, what is something that came about in the Persian Empire that Jesus deals with in the New Testament, if we remember? Do you remember? Say what? Yes, that's part of it. That's one of the things. I didn't cover that in the class, but crucifixion was something that was invented by the Persians. But what else? Clay? Okay, I thought you were saying something. But the answer that I was looking for was the language of Aramaic was introduced by the Persians, as well as the culture and the religious worship inside synagogues is also introduced by the Persians. And then you also get into as what they would coin as the intertestamental period, and that's where you get Alexander the Great, the Ptolemaic domination, the Seleucid domination. There's a lot of history there. I did my best to cover kind of the highlights last week. But of course, you can't get everything in just 1 hour. Then, of course, that brings us to the Roman occupation. So in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, I put it at the top of the outline. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star, and when it rose, and have come to worship him.'" So I chose this scripture because we read in our New Testaments all the time about the Romans. We read about Herod. But what is so significant about these people? Specifically Herod. Herod is mentioned a lot in the New Testament. He's mentioned a handful of times early on in Jesus' life. Of course, we have here of him inquiring these wise men about the birth of the supposed Messiah. And of course, these wise men are also saying that Jesus is supposed to be the king of the Jews, but here we have Herod, who's the king of the Jews. So who's the real king here, and how in the world is Herod the king if the Romans are in charge? And so those are all very, I would say, valid questions, and hopefully some questions I can answer today. But it all kind of started so we kind of covered and finished it last week, but after the Jewish revolt, the Maccabean revolt, we have the rising of these priest kings that are descendants from I think their names are, Matthias and Judas. So their descendants eventually became these priest kings that ruled over the Jewish people and that kingdom for a while, until you get to these two men named Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. I wish they would choose easier to pronounce names, but that's what we're dealing with right now. So these two men rose to power, and they were the last rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty. So what had happened at this time, so over in the west, you have Julius Caesar. He's not famous at all, if you didn't know. Julius Caesar has finished conquering in Gaul, and he's now made himself emperor. And after he makes himself emperor, he's emperor for a while, and this causes a civil war ends up happening, as you know, in modern history. There's Mark Antony, Octavian, and Pompey. And one of those men, Pompey, was a general, and he was a big high advisor underneath Julius Caesar. He, to, support his claim for the throne, goes and starts conquering the enemies in the east. So you got to think the Seleucids, those were the men that were over the Hasmoneans as well, were involved in that. So that would include the area of Judea. So here comes Pompey, and he comes into Jerusalem. He comes into this area. But at the time, the rulers were Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. So Aristobulus did not want anything to do with the Romans. He wanted to keep his power as king or as co-ruler of his very small and insignificant land compared to what the Romans had. But Hyrcanus, I'm going to say 3 different things. I'm just going to go with it. He wanted support from the Romans because he knew, he was smart enough to know that if you stand in Rome's way, you're either going to die or you join them. So he decides that he wants to join the Romans. So what ends up happening is they come in, Pompey comes in with the Romans, they capture Jerusalem, and they choose Hyrcanus to become the high priest because he wanted to support Rome. And then what they did was they took Aristobulus and they imprisoned him. So underneath Hyrcanus, there was an influential advisor named Antipater. And you'll know Antipater, he'll become a very common name because Antipater was the father of the Herod that we see in the New Testament. So Antipater comes into power, but the interesting about Antipater is he was what is called an Idumean. So that is the Latin word for an Edomite. And if you know anything about your Old Testament, who do the Edomites come from? From Esau. So who are technically their long-lost cousins, if you will? The Jews. So the Edomites and the Jews, which they have a very long history of not liking each other. They have a history of liking each other, not liking each other. It just depends on who's in power at the time. But to the Romans, they just saw him and they were like, oh, you're a Jew. You know, you're an Edomite. You're somehow related to we don't care. We'll take you. We'll put you in power to deal with this area because you know the area well. You're an Edomite. You're an Idumean. You know how these people work. You know these people function. And so what Rome was doing was what any conquering nation would do if they're going to put people in power to support them. They put Hyrcanus in power, the high priest, so now you have religious control over the Jews. And then he put Antipater in charge of political and judicial power. And so that's how you have that control over those people. But to them, of course, they didn't care that he was an Edomite. But to a Jew, you care an awful lot that he's an Edomite. Because he's like, he's not one of us. I don't like him. I don't want anything to do with him. So there's already problems there. So we have Hyrcanus and Antipater the Idumean. But under the rule of the Romans, Antipater was given powers by later Pompey and then later emperors as well to rebuild and to get taxes from these people. And he would go on, his son Herod would do great things. I'll kind of highlight that stuff in a little bit. But this was, all in all, for the sake of Jerusalem and the Jews, this was the most stable it's going to ever be for a long time underneath the Roman rule. They're going to get relative freedom to kind of do what they want, but also still being under the thumb of the Romans. They didn't like that part a whole lot, but they had a lot more freedom than they did underneath the Seleucids, underneath all the other empires that had come before them. But the one important thing that I think we need to highlight here is underneath the Romans, and I kind of put this in point number 2, the Jewish religion became known as religio licita, which basically gave them religious freedom to practice Judaism without having to sacrifice to the emperors or having to sacrifice to the pagan gods that the Romans believed in. This was a rule that the Romans would implement to kind of keep the peace with people they conquered because they were tolerable to these people. Because when you rule an empire that large, you have to let some things go. Because if you don't, you're going to have a rebellion every other day in every other part of your empire, which is what the Romans didn't want. So what they did is they gave some of these people that they conquered religious freedom to practice and to worship who they wanted to, as long as at the end of the day they were loyal to the Rome state. As long as they were loyal to and supported and gave their taxes to the Romans themselves. So it was kind of a mutual, I would say, I can't think of the scientific word for this, but like the relationship. It was like, I would say it's a symbiotic relationship. That, yes, my mom's shaking her head. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Where the Romans would get out of it the good things, and so would the people that they conquered, but it wasn't necessarily great for the people that they conquered because they didn't have, freedom to rule themselves. But at the end of the day, they've got Roman technology, Roman roads, Roman protection. There's a thing we'll cover later, Pax Romana, which is Roman peace, which during that time period, there was relative peace inside that empire. There was not fear of bandits. There wasn't fear of people taking your stuff. There wasn't a lot of crime because those Romans, although they were very, it wasn't fun to be underneath them. They protected you. They took care of you because they wanted you to, well, A, not to rebel, but B, to pay your taxes. And you can't pay taxes if you don't have a good economy. And if you don't have a good, if you don't have good soldier presence, anyway, you get the point. But there was a lot of good that kind of came out of this occupation. And later, especially in the book of Acts, you'll see how important it was that there was religio licita. Because later in Acts, I know we're not going to study Acts in this class, but the Romans confused Christianity with Judaism in the book of Acts. And when the Pharisees and all these people that didn't like Christianity were like, hey, these Christians are doing all this, and the Romans are like, that's a Jewish problem because that's a part of Judaism. We don't deal with that. Y'all handle that yourselves. So it was good for Christianity because they thought it was just Judaism. So we had relative freedom to do whatever we wanted to religiously whenever, of course, the church was started in Acts 2. And I think that's part of God's providence as well, because, if Jesus had come any years earlier into the Seleucid, he wouldn't have that freedom to do that. But yet, in God's providence, he was born into the Roman Empire in that time where he was able, after his death, and his followers were able to spread Christianity like a wildfire because of that relative religious freedom. Okay, so after Antipater came Herod. So Antipater was actually killed by poisoning. Ironically enough. They don't really know why. But if I had to guess, it was probably his son wanting to come into power. Usually how that worked. So after his death in 43 BC, there was a power struggle that ensued between Antigonus, who is the son of, you'll remember his name, Aristobulus. So it's the guy before in the Hasmonean dynasty. His son, so basically the former prince, if you want to call him, was vying for the throne, as well as Hyrcanus' son and Antipater's two sons, Herod and Phasael, on the other side. So these four men, or three if you really want to just, it's Phasael, Herod, and Antigonus. These men were fighting for the throne over in Judea because they wanted it. But the problem that arose was Antigonus chose to align himself with the Parthians. And if you know anything about history, the Parthians are what they call the desert Romans. So the Parthians in Parthia had a massive empire in the east, and they were Rome's direct, I guess you could call it, enemies, nemesis, if you want to call them, the direct competition. And so here you have a power struggle in Judea where one side wants to side with the Parthians, and then you have Herod, who was smart, and he goes, yeah, I'm going to side with the Romans because I want, what's cooking over there. But what ended up happening was Phasael and Hyrcanus were captured after the war between the Romans and the Parthians over Palestine. Herod, during this war, fled to Rome. And so when he fled to Rome, he was able to there, I guess, kind of grovel and basically become buddy-buddy with all these high Roman senators and officials over in Rome. And so what ended up happening is they're like, hey, you're from that area. Hey, you've got political ties. You've got the heritage. You've got all this. And so what happened is when the Romans won, they appointed Herod king over Palestine to kind of be a Roman puppet to them because he's loyal to them. So he became the king, if you will, I'd say that in air quotes, in 37 BC of Palestine. Now Herod, the interesting thing about Herod is from a worldly perspective, he was actually a great ruler for the area. They call him in secular history Herod the Great because he built a ton of stuff for the people over there. Now, in a biblical mindset, he's pictured not so highly and not so high up and lifted. But you also have to think, what's the Bible's perspective from? From the Jews and from, Jesus and, his ministry and all that. And how did they view him? Because you got to remember, what is Herod? An Edomite. He's an Idumean. They don't like him at all already. And then not only is he an Edomite, he's also a supporter of Rome. He's a supporter of the occupation that they cannot stand. And so they really don't like him. So that's why in the Bible, he's really not painted in a good light, but that's also for good measure because of what he does as well, or what his son eventually does as well. But under Herod, so the book describes Herod, he was a volatile, combination of a clever and efficient ruler and a cruel tyrant. On one hand, he was distrustful, jealous, and brutal, ruthlessly crushing any potential opposition. Because he was an Idumean or an Edomite, the Jews never accepted him as their legitimate king, and that rejection infuriated him because he's ruling over these people, but they don't want him. And so you have this seeming power, but even your own people don't like you, so how much power do you actually have? Not a whole lot. So to legitimize his claim to the throne, he divorced his wife, Doris, and he married a Hasmonean princess, which, if you recall, the Hasmoneans were the previous rulers of Judea, named Mary Am, later executing her when he suspected she was plotting against him. So Herod was not a very good guy in that regard. They even say, so he even had three of his sons from another wife, or three of his sons and another wife and his mother-in-law met the same fate when they were suspected of conspiracy. So this man was scared. He was, he didn't like a lot of that. So even he killed so many people that were around him that even the Roman Emperor Augustus once said that he would rather be one of Herod's pigs than his son because of how evil he was. And if you know anything about the Jews, they don't eat pigs. So the fact that Augustus said he'd rather be one of his pigs than his own family says a lot about who Herod the Great was. But Herod would go on to build many things, and he actually did really care. Well, I wouldn't say he really cared. He just kind of wanted to win favor of the Jews. So he did a lot of things for the Jews themselves. That's why he was called Herod the Great. But he rebuilt the temple, which is the temple that we see Jesus in the New Testament. And it's eventually the temple that when the Romans came and conquered Jerusalem in AD 70, that's the temple they tore down, was Herod's temple. And it's still, there's a part of it still up today. That's what we call the Wailing Wall. That's the wall that the Hebrews will go up and pray to in Jerusalem currently today. And that's the wall from Herod's temple. So it's a lot different than the wall or the temple that Solomon built. It's way removed from what Solomon built, but it is the temple nonetheless. But Herod would have been the one that gave the order to kill all the firstborn in Matthew chapter 2. So you like I mentioned earlier in Matthew 2 verses 1 through 2, he was inquiring to these wise men, who is this Messiah and where is he at that you claim is coming to be the king of the Jews? Because he's king of the Jews. He's like, I didn't do all this work for someone to usurp me based upon some prophecy I don't even believe in. So he was paranoid enough as is. He's so paranoid he kills his own family. So you think it's beneath him to go kill a bunch of firstborn in some small backwater town in Judea? No, it's nothing to him. And actually, outside of the Bible, there is no historical mention of the murder of those children in Bethlehem. And from a historical perspective, you would point at that and you'd be a skeptic and you would say, well, then that must not have happened if nothing was, because, there's so many firstborn that would have died. But at the same time, if you're a king that wants to give a very picturesque view of yourself, would you record you killing a bunch of firstborn children? No, I wouldn't do that either. So, but it's very in character for a man who kills his own family because he suspects conspiracy to go kill a whole village worth of children, firstborn children in a certain time frame because he suspected that's where the next king's going to come from. So it's very in character, but this is Herod the Great. He eventually would die. Let me go to, let's see. So after he died in 4 BC, and they suspect that it was something to do with intestinal cancer from historical context. And as a final act of vengeance against his contemptuous subjects, what he did is he rounded up leading Jews and commanded that at his death they should be executed. So he took Jewish leadership at the time and he executed him. So to give the Jews even more reason to hate the Roman occupation and to hate the Herodian dynasty, as a last act of defiance, he killed those who disagreed with him as well. So it's pretty horrible. And his reasoning, as history records, is if there's going to be no mourning for his death, at least there would be mourning at his death. And that's what he recorded, which is kind of awful, if you ask me. Sounds like a real stand-up guy. But that's what he did after he died. Also, during this time, as I put underneath A, during the time of the Romans and during the time of Antipater and, of course, of Herod the Great, this is when they would have appointed their own high priests, one by the Romans and one by the Janus, appointed in 6 AD, and then Caiaphas in 15 AD. And those are the two high priests that you see in the New Testament. And this is why when Jesus went to trial, whenever he was going to be crucified, he had to have two trials underneath two high priests, because one was a Roman official that was appointed high priest, and the other was a Jewish appointed high priest. And so that's why he had to go do both of them. So after Herod the Great's death, you're going to have a power vacuum, a power struggle. And Herod had three sons. So he had Philip, Antipas, and Archelaus. Okay? And later in the New Testament, you'll read a lot about, I would say Archelaus is the one who's written about the most, because he was not a very kind man at all. And then Antipas is also the other one. You don't read much about Philip in the New Testament, but Archelaus and Antipas were the two biggest ones. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter reference there in Luke chapter 3. Who would like to read that for me? I'll take a hand raise. For Luke 3:1, I think it's, Luke 3:1 through 2. Anybody? Jim? Okay. Luke 3:1 through 2. Yes, sir.
Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. In the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness.
Okay, so there's a lot of names given, and that's why I love the book of the Gospel of Luke, because like he said, like we covered a couple weeks ago, Luke said he was going to take a historical account of what's going on. So Luke gives us a date and to follow for this. So we'll cover Pontius Pilate here later, but you have Herod being the tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, the tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis and Lysanias. So you got Philip and you've got Herod, but that's Herod Antipas, okay? Herod Antipas, I believe, is who that one is. So that's there's two sons. That's the two sons of Herod the Great. So you have in Matthew 2, you have their father, Herod the Great, who ordered the killing of those children in Bethlehem, and of course he was evil in a lot of other ways. But then his three sons are the ones that they split up power of Judea. So I think, let me see, where is this? Herod Antipas became the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea from his father's death. So that would be kind of the primary region that Jesus is doing his ministry, was in the area of Galilee. A lot of his ministry was done there. So the primary ruler during Jesus, as far as the Herodian dynasty would be Herod Antipas. So he would be the one in charge. But not only that, you have the mention of the two high priests there as well, Annas and Caiaphas. So that would be something to note that we can talk about later, and we'll get more. But Luke name drops the emperor of the time, Tiberius Caesar. And now you can go, I didn't list a bunch of things about him, but you can go and you can look historically at what Tiberius was doing, his policies. He didn't really deal a lot with Judea. But when you get accounts in the Bible we'll cover it later, especially in Matthew chapter 22, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming up to Jesus asking, what about taxes to Caesar? And of course, they would have shown him the coin with Caesar's head on it, and that Caesar would have been Tiberius. So if you want to have some connection to the New Testament and you want some visuals, you can go look up that coin and see what Jesus would have saw. Of course, Emperor Tiberius. And of course, later in the New Testament, you'll have Domitian, which he was not a very good emperor. He was the emperor during the time of Revelation, and that's why they were dealing with the problems they were dealing with Revelation, because he was not a very nice man. But at this time, it was Tiberius. So after the death of Herod the Great, you got his three sons. So Archelaus was apparently not a kind man. We can turn to Matthew chapter 2. So Matthew chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. There's mention of Archelaus here. And in the Bible and even in history itself, his name might have been Archelaus or Archelaus or whatever you want to say, but he's going to be referred to as, different names. He'll be referred to as Herod, which is what Antipas is referred to as well, because Herod is a title of king at the time. But there's different names for him. So Matthew 2, can I get someone to read 19 through 23? Who would like to read that? Okay, Robert. All right, Matthew 2, verses 19 through 23.
And when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and he came to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in the city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene.
So there we have the mention of Herod the Great. So after Herod the Great died, and so if you want to put a date on this, he died, what was it? What did I say? I think it was, I didn't have it written down. So he died in 4 BC. So he's dead in 4 BC. And so after his death, or supposed around there, Joseph takes his family and he's like, we have to go to Egypt, because he knew who his son was going to be, which is Archelaus. And Archelaus is not a kind man, according to the Bible, and even according to secular history as well. He, like his father, was very paranoid. And so he was also a murderer of people who did not listen to him. And so it was if you know anything about history, and even in our own country, when is the most turmoil happen in a country? When power is being turned over. So when there's new policies, new people are coming into positions of government, it's scary for everyone, because no one knows what it's going to look like. No one knows how our lives are going to be changed or what's going to be different. And so even back then, it was more so because, you could have one guy that's super peaceful and super caring to a certain group of people, and then his son or his, deposed nephew or someone come into power through blood or conquering or war. And usually those transitions of power are not peaceful at all back then. And so this new people come in, and they can hate your group of people now. When you used to live in peace, now they hate you. And so, of course, Joseph knew that. He knew that Archelaus was not going to be kind, so that's why they fled. But then when they came back, that's why they went to Nazareth, because who was that under? Under Antipas. It was under one of the different sons. They got out of the area of his jurisdiction, so they didn't have to deal with the problems. But according to Old Testament prophecy, what did that also do? It fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. The fact that they went to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus grew up, was in Nazareth. And so you have history now being mixed. I wouldn't say being mixed. I would say that history is only just proving God's providence. But you have God's prophecy and his providence that he had told in the Old Testament all coming to fruition in the child of Jesus. And you can see those influences and why that happened because of, modern history or ancient history. Antipas was the other one. He was given rule over Galilee and Nazareth, and he appears several times in the Gospels. So if I could get someone to read Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 through 29, or not Matthew, Mark chapter 6. Who would like to read that? Mark 6, verses 14 through 29. Camden, you want to read that? And then I need someone to read Luke 13, 31 through 33. Who would like to do that? Clay? Okay. Luke 13, 31 through 33. And then Luke 23, 6 through 12. Who would like to do that? Dad? Okay. All right. So, Camden, would you like to read Mark 6, verses 14 through 29?
Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent a laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was just He was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb.
So here we have, of course, the Herod that's being mentioned is Herod Antipas. So this is one of the sons of Herod the Great. And Philip is even mentioned as well. So if you remember the three sons, you have Antipas, you have Archelaus, and you have Philip. So now you have all three mentions of those three sons in the New Testament. Of course, Herod Antipas took Philip's wife and married her, which, of course, is a huge problem, huge no-no. And John pointed that out, and that is what got John the Baptist killed. So there you have mention. So Herod Antipas was not necessarily a nice guy either. It seems like there's a history of killings associated with the Herodian dynasty. Not very nice people at all. All right, Clay, if you want to do Luke 13, verses 31 through 33.
On that very day, some Pharisees came, saying to him, "Get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem."
Okay, so there we have another story mentioning Herod Antipas. And Herod, he wants to kill Jesus because, you see all these people, especially, earlier in the gospel, and you have, of course, the feeding the 5,000. You've got all these miracles that Jesus is performing, and it's going to gather a lot of attention. And to these Jews, they had the wrong mindset about it. We read about it all the time that they wanted a physical king to come and save them from the oppression they had faced. And rightfully so. After the history we covered last week and the things we examined, they've gone through a lot. These people have been so oppressed, so beaten down by their oppressors, that all they want is this Messiah that they've thought about probably their entire lives. And here comes Jesus performing these miracles and proclaiming himself and others proclaiming him as well to be the Messiah. And of course you have John the Baptist as well saying, I'm preparing the way of the Lord. I'm preparing the way for the man that is the Messiah. And so these people are going, yes, he's here. The man that's going to take the Romans away from us, the man that's going to depose the Herodian dynasty away from us, we're finally going to be free once again. But of course, as we know, and you read your New Testament, that's not the purpose of why Jesus came here. But if you're Herod the king at the time and you have this supposed power over these people and you hear about this man that's supposed to take your spot, what are you going to want to do to him? You're going to want to kill him, just like your dad did when people were conspiring against him. You just kill him. That's as easy as that. I'll deal with this rebellion real quick. I'll kill him right now. But that's not what was going to happen. And we all know that's not how Jesus died because that's not what God's plan was for him. So there was no way Herod was going to be able to kill him. But that's what Herod wanted to do. And you're going to see mentions of that as well in the New Testament. All right. Luke 23, verses 6 through 12. Dad?
It says, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man was a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracles done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. The chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, where previously they had been in enmity with each other.
So here you have Jesus finally meeting Herod. And Herod makes kind of a show of it, and I guess you would say rightfully so, because here is a man that he's heard for many, many years that's supposedly the king that's going to replace him. And Jesus comes before him, and Herod's accusing him, and he's asking him these questions like, oh, you're the king that they're talking about? And you'll read other gospel accounts where they would ask Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And he would say, so you say. Because Jesus has never claimed to be king of the Jews. He's just been claimed by other people to be king of the Jews. And so here's Jesus, and he's not even giving Herod the time of day. Herod's questioning him, and Jesus gives him no answer. And so what does Herod resort to? Mocking him. Which, from a Christian perspective, that kind of hurts my heart a lot. The fact that here's Jesus, literally, who came down from heaven, the creator of the world, and here's this backwater king who isn't even really a king, arraying him in these beautiful robes and mocking him. And to me, that hurts me. But I understand from a worldly perspective why Herod did what he did, because here's this man claiming to be a king, and he's not even a king. And so you're going to make fun of him. I mean, because to him, it's hilarious, the fact that this man thinks he's a king. Some man from Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, claiming to be a king, when I'm the one with all the power. I'm the one that at the snap of my fingers, I could cut your head off like I did with John the Baptist. And so, I mean, he has, I guess you could say, a right to do that. But to me, it makes me sick to my stomach when I think about what Herod and, of course, what the Romans did. But, of course, that also just proves that he was not a very nice man, and neither was any of his brothers. But as we know from the Bible, this Herod Antipas was also the one that executed John the Baptist. So when you read, that is the son of Herod the Great that killed John the Baptist. And he's also the one that participated in Jesus' trial. So Herod Antipas. So eventually these men would be deposed of. They would kind of just become puppet kings, because the Romans were getting tired of dealing with non-Romans as their leaders. And so later, when Rome became sort of an empire, because they were really just a Senate, kind of democracy early on. They were a republic early on in their history, and eventually it became an empire when the emperor took over. So when the emperor took over, he wanted to have complete control over his provinces. And so that's where you get governors and proconsuls and these men like Pilate. And so Pilate was appointed by the Roman government to kind of govern the area of Judea and Samaria. And a lot of people want to sit here and say that this was kind of punishment. Pilate may not have done well in another position, or he might not have been as important or as wealthy, because to get these positions, you had to have been from a wealthy family in Rome. Because the way that Rome worked is if you had the influence, the money, and the family name, you'd get high in Roman society. You'd shoot high. So that's why, you think about the name Caesar, why the name Caesar was such a huge, massive name, that after Julius Caesar died, of course, he had his successor, and then after he died, they didn't really have any successors. So what do these men do when they become emperor? They take the title of Caesar, because it's it's an important family name. It imbues power, responsibility, wealth, all these other things. So name and wealth and status and all these were huge in Rome. So a man with not a lot of name, not a lot of status, not a lot of wealth, but was still had enough, like Pilate, would be governor over a small area like Judea and Samaria. So Pilate would have been followed by, of course, Felix and Festus, which is what you get in Acts, the book of Acts. Those are the senators that followed him. But not only that, but, Pilate, he would not do a very well job at quelling the rebellious flame that was fueling in the Jewish people. Because what he did, you'll find it's never a smart idea, especially with over in Jerusalem, is he went into Jerusalem, he installed military standards and propaganda for the Caesars. So what he did is he went and put military flags. So he would put, of course, legionary flags and standards all throughout Jerusalem to basically show, hey, we're Romans, we occupied here, we're in charge. But to a Jew, what is this? This is now idol worship. Because you have this imperial man that's coming in going, the only thing you should worship is the power of Rome. And to a Jew, they're going, I only worship God. And so the fact you're coming into my city that I see as holy, that I see as the place of my worship, and you're putting it military standards, only makes me hate you even more. And so that's some other problems they were dealing with. But not only that, but Pilate took funds from the temple, which, as you know from the Seleucid dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, all those, that's also not very smart. He took the funds from the temple and he built a Roman aqueduct feeding into Jerusalem. And you can also see that today in modern day. You can go to Jerusalem and you can see the aqueduct that he built. But he also put down an uprising of the Samaritans, which, if you want to turn, is in Luke chapter 13. This is mentioned in the Bible. So Luke chapter 13, verses 1 through 2. Let's see. I'll read that. So Luke 13, 1 through 2, it's recorded, it says, "There were some present at the very time who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he answered them, 'Do you think that those Galileans, or do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way?'" And then, of course, the story goes on. But he's mentioning the fact that Pilate murdered these Samaritans because they were trying to start a rebellion against the Romans. And what do you do if you're the Romans and someone's trying to start a rebellion? You kill them, you murder them, and you take care of the problem. But that, of course, is something you can look at history and learn about, but it's something that's also mentioned in the Bible. Furthermore, proving the legitimacy of the Bible, if you ask me, but that's just a side note. Of course, like I said in letter D, Pilate is followed by Felix and Festus, which are mentioned in Acts. And of course, Antipas was eventually banished from the region. So that, of course, is the king that killed John the Baptist and, had problems with Jesus. And then eventually of course, in Acts, they would be united again by Herod Agrippa, who was the nephew of Antipas. So that's, of course, more family of the Herodian dynasty. And of course, Herod Agrippa's death was recorded in Acts chapter 12. And then his son Agrippa II would rule after him. And that's kind of the later part of Acts that's recorded. So there are some positive things that came out of being under Roman rule. Of course, we've mentioned a few, but Greek continued to be the main language. So as we all know, the New Testament is written in Greek, and that's because the Romans kept alive that tradition of Grecian culture, of Hellenism in that area, because the common language, like I mentioned last week, in that eastern part of the empire was Greek. Latin was, of course, only used in law or in the western part of the Roman Empire. But like I mentioned earlier, there was also Pax Romana. So Pax Romana, or Roman peace, if you're not speaking Latin, gave these people the peace and freedom inside the empire's border, where elsewhere in the world it was not so peaceful and not so free. There was also advancements in transportation and communication, which would become important in the book of Acts when Paul is doing his missionary journeys, because there's relative security to go around and do all these missionary journeys. He's able to travel much easier because of Roman roads, of course, Roman infrastructure, and the advancement of the gospel made a lot easier because of Roman advancements, because of communication, these roads. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, Christianity would be later considered religio licita because of its association with Judaism. Okay, so in these kind of closing minutes of class today, I want to read a couple of scriptures. And I know we've covered a lot of history. We've covered a lot of things these last 2 weeks. But I want to look at some scriptures and I want to see what y'all get out of it from what we've learned and kind of about history and how and why the Bible chose to say what it says. So the first example I want to do and look at is Matthew chapter 22. So Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22. And who would like to read that? Someone hasn't read yet. Anybody? Not everybody at once. Would you? Okay, go ahead.
Then the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with their Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone. For you do not regard the person of men. Tell us therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the tax money." So they brought him a denarius, and he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's."
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, you can.
When they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way.
Okay, so after everything that we've learned, why do you think, what do you think is important to draw from this passage from what we've learned about history so far? Yes, Mary.
Well, they brought the Herodians.
There you go. That's what I wanted to point out. So the Herodians, just based upon the name, who do you think they support? The Romans, but also who? Herod, right? They support the Herodian dynasty. So here are these Pharisees are bringing these Herodians along with them that A, support Rome, and B, support the Herodian dynasty. And they want to catch Jesus in a trap, speaking against the Romans and speaking against the Herodian dynasty, so they have a reason to kill him. And Jesus, of course, knows this. He's not, I would say Jesus was probably very, very smart. But they come up to him and they're like, and they give him all these flowery words and like, teacher, we know you would never speak against people. You know, we know you never do that. But what are your opinions, teacher, on paying taxes to Caesar, as if they didn't have Herodian supporters standing right behind them, and they're asking about Roman officials? And Jesus is like, well, that's an easy question. Render unto Caesar what Caesar wants, and render unto God what God wants. I get what you're trying to do here, but it's not going to hurt me. And so it's important to know that the Herodians and the history behind that and who they support and the reason they're asking that question, because we could read that and just go, well, that's kind of weird that Jesus is being asked that question, And, we have many sermons about, render unto the government what the government requires and, render unto God what he requires. And then, of course, there's a lot of things you can draw out of that. But from a gospel perspective and from their time period, what do you see from that? There's a lot of history and a lot of strife that is just asked in that one little question that those people asked. And Jesus has to navigate through that every day and every part of his ministry. He has to be so careful with the words he says, because there's a purpose for him to die and to be resurrected and to be raised, but it had to come at the right time, and it had to be on his own timing. So he had to be so careful to navigate all of these intricacies of the political world they were dealing with, the cultural war they were dealing with, because you have these men that are supporting these Herodians that, if you know, like I mentioned earlier, will kill anyone that is paranoid about you conspiring against them, that are coming up and asking him, hey, do you support us or not? And to Jesus, he has to answer to those questions, because and I think as well from a theological perspective, he's also showing that he's not here to be a physical king. He's here for things that are more than just physical. And so by him answering that, he's also proving his message that he's trying to get across, which is, of course, the message of salvation, eternal life, and, the church, all these things. But there's just, and I hope that from this study and from this historical kind of background, that when you read your New Testament, that this all kind of opens up to you. That you look at this and you go, oh, I understand more of why that is in the Bible. Why do the Hellenists treat the Jews the way that they do? Why do the Herodians treat the Jews the way that they do? Why do the Romans treat the Jews the way that they do? Why are there zealots? Why are there Pharisees? Why are there There's reasons that these people are who they are. And there's reasons why they act the way that they do towards certain people. And to me, learning about this opens my eyes to the spectrum of problems that Jesus had to deal with. But not only that, the glory that comes out of it. The fact that Jesus could navigate all of this and still point back to God and show the love that he did. And we look back at this, and I feel like from the eyes of a 21st century American, and we go, how easy did they have it back then with spreading God's word? They converted thousands of people all the time. Jesus had such a way with words that he converted all these people. But you read this and you begin to see how complicated it was back then, and then we compare it to today. How much more do we deal with political parties today? You have people that support, the LGBTQ, whatever, and then you got people that are Democrats, people that are Republicans, people that come from different religious backgrounds. We deal with the same problems that Jesus dealt with. It's just different titles and different people. But Jesus was able to do the things that he did. And I think that if we just understand history, we understand that everything is always going to be the same. It's never changed for us, and it's not going to change. I don't want to sit up here and keep preaching, but you get the point. And I'm not going to go over the rest of the scriptures, but if you would like to, for some homework, I guess you could say, look into Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 18, 12 through 24. And just kind of see what you can grasp out of that based upon our discussion of history. I really appreciate the time that I've been given today. Next week, we're going to try to get into, I haven't really decided yet if I'm going to get into the religious background or the social background into what Jesus is dealing with. But I've really enjoyed this study, and I hope you have too. We're going to have one more song, and then we'll have a prayer. Clay, do you want anyone to lead the prayer, or are you going to lead it? You lead it, okay. All right, well, again, thank you guys for your time.